Hello and welcome to FP Live. I'm Ravi Agrawal, Foreign Policy's Editor-in-Chief. Are human rights at a modern low point? One can certainly make the case that they are. Authoritarian leaders are in vogue, inequality is rampant, there's a global backlash against gender equality, the number of forcibly displaced people is at an all-time high, there are ongoing conflicts on multiple continents, global freedom, according to one key index out this week, declined for the 19th consecutive year. It's a lot. But what does all of this mean in terms of human rights and how they are enforced? In a moment, I will speak with a renowned expert on this very issue. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. You can use the code FPLive to become a subscriber. Members get to watch past episodes as well as submit questions to our guests. We often use them. We also have a free podcast available wherever you get your audio. So, my guest today, he's been on FP Live once before, actually, but that was a panel from Davos a long time ago. Kenneth Roth ran Human Rights Watch from 1993 until he stepped down in 2022, dramatically growing that organization during his tenure. Roth sometimes writes for FP these days. He has a new book detailing the history of his advocacy and all the things, all the lessons he's learned. It's called Righting Wrongs. Ken, welcome to FP Live.
Ravi, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And congrats on the book.
Thanks.
So there's so much in the news right now, especially with the Trump administration making the dramatic moves that it is. I want to put all of that aside for a few minutes, and I want to start with a bigger picture question and look at a period of the last few decades, let's say ending in 2024. And I'm curious about the trend lines on human rights, Ken. I was looking at a report from Amnesty International last year in which they cited the sci-fi film Back to the Future. And the report says we're hurtling backwards past the 1948 promise of universal human rights. Is that right?
I would not be that apocalyptic. I've been, doing this for a while. In fact, I opened my book with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., where it's often cited, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I point out, as he does too later in the speech, but nobody ever cites the rest of the speech, that in fact, the defense of rights is a relentless struggle. Governments are always tempted to violate human rights. The task of the human rights movement is to raise or to change the cost-benefit analysis of repression. And so if I look back, over the time that I ran Human Rights Watch, I started in the Cold War, where we were dealing with, a very fixed situation, a very repressive situation in Eastern Europe, proxy wars around the world. Then there was, a moment where it seemed that freedom was going to prevail. We then had the ethnic conflicts in places like Bosnia or Rwanda. We went through a period where that eased. Then we had Bush's war on terrorism with all the disaster that foretold. These days, the big issue is the global contest between autocracy and democracy. And I think that accounts for the backsliding that everybody cites, as well as a series of, highly abusive wars. Syria until just recently, Ukraine, Myanmar, Gaza. And in all of these, maybe it's inherent in who I am, given what I do, but I tend to see the glass as half full. When it comes to the wartime atrocities, not only has there been global outrage, but the International Criminal Court has been stepping in and charging people and really reaffirming the standards. When it comes to autocracy, I take heart from the fact that when you look at people around the world, they want democracy. People keep coming out into the streets despite the risk of arrest or even being shot to stand for democracy. And, sometimes they prevail, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. Other times they don't because autocrats are strong, but they make clear what they want. And the big challenge, ironically, today is in the established Western democracies, where people who feel left behind, not answered for by their governments, not respected, not heard, are turning their backs on democracy and embracing far-right alternatives. So, we do have a threat there, but I do think that this can be addressed if governments learn to better answer to the needs and the desires of their people.
I think it's so cool, Ken, that you feel the optimism that you do, or the hope that you do, at least. In as much as some states feel less constrained than they should, or maybe than they used to, What do you think is the reason there? I mean, you talked about the this sort of grand battle of ideas, as it were, between democracies and autocracies, something that former President Biden used to talk about as well a lot. Um, but what is it that in that sort of struggle, and then also within democracies, what is it that allows human rights abuses to happen, and sometimes with seeming impunity?
Well, Ravi, I mean, the way we stop human rights violations, and I give many examples in my book, is, as I say, raising the cost of them. And we do that, in part by tarnishing the reputation of abusive governments, in part by trying to deprive them of things that they want until they change, whether that be arms sales or military aid or preferential trade benefits or, simply being welcome as legitimate members of the international community. Sometimes we get them prosecuted. And it's a matter of, arranging a sufficient group of disincentives to abuse that allow us to change governments. I think these days, particularly with the US government pulling back from the defense of human rights, some governments feel that they can get away with it. Putin
Mhm.
miscalculated, in his COVID-induced isolation. He thought that invading Ukraine would be a cakewalk. He didn't understand how difficult it would be. He resorted to the same techniques he'd used in Syria, where sadly he did get away with impunity, as you mentioned. Xi Jinping has been severely repressing the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, thinking he can get away with it, even though we came very close to getting him addressed by the UN Human Rights Council. And Xi Jinping was personally calling heads of state to try to fend that off. So, this is a battle, and that's just what it is. And we need to bolster the defenders of human rights. At this moment, a number of European democracies are in disarray. We were in a poorer position today to fight back than we were in the first Trump term, where we had Merkel, we had Macron, a much more united government. We had a stronger British government. So we need to, in a sense, rebuild the defenses. But we've learned that even without the United States defending human rights, if we put together coalitions of democracies around the world, we still can exert very significant pressure to defend human rights.
So you mentioned there the sort of naming and shaming as a tool that you have often used at Human Rights Watch and that human rights organizations often deploy to tarnish the reputations of people who are abusing human rights. But a couple of things feel relatively new that I think make that harder. So one is this general sense that, well, a lot of Western countries aren't following the rules themselves, so why should we? Which is a theme you often hear from dictators, that let's just muddy the waters so that, we're just like everyone else. Who are you to call us out, in other words? The other one, Ken, is just this idea that truth itself is now a contested thing. And part of this is because of the speed at which the internet moves. But I say this as a journalist, it is harder and harder to convince people of what is actually going on when they have an alternative reality they can point to that seems convincing to them.
I mean, Robbie, I think you're right. It is more difficult. I mean, let me just begin with the basics, which is that, shaming works because even in today's world, every government, as a matter of basic legitimacy, has to pretend to respect human rights. They all say that they do. Now, they obviously fall short. And what human rights groups do is, carefully document and spotlight that discrepancy between pretense and practice. And every government finds that shameful, delegitimizing. They all want to avoid it. This is not a matter of personal remorse. I'm not in the psychology business. I'm not trying to change these dictators into good people. I'm just trying to force them to change by paying a reputational price for their repression. Now, the hypocrisy factor does matter because it gives governments that are asked to take a stand a good excuse to avoid doing so. And we see this, for example, when a number of governments, say particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, are saying, well, why should we condemn what Putin is doing in Ukraine when Biden and now Trump are just underwriting the same thing in Gaza? So it's a cheap excuse, but it is one that politically does work. As to your point about the truth, I mean, yes, we are way past the point where, you listen to Walter Cronkite and you learn what's going on. So there is, a much more diverse source of information out there. People who want to know the truth still can. They still read FP. They still can look to Human Rights Watch. There are certain respected sources. And so I'm less worried about, can you find the truth than the many people who don't really bother and are just willing to kind of consume what shows up on their social media feeds. So it is a more difficult information environment. But, if you look even in a place like Russia, where they're just, overwhelmed by propaganda, the government, the Kremlin tries to impose censorship, but even the Kremlin didn't dare shut down YouTube. It didn't dare shut down Telegram. People still use VPNs. You can get information. If you want to know the truth, despite that closed information environment, you can. And the truth is still very powerful. Governments are making enormous efforts to try to suppress it.
Mm. And dictators and monarchs as well really care about ultimately what the people think. They want to be loved.
I mean, absolutely. If you look at, why is Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi crown prince, why is he suddenly advocating a Palestinian state when he could care less about the Palestinians? It's because the Saudi people have been watching Al Jazeera and they've seen what Israel's doing in Gaza. And their outrage influences even a monarch who's highly repressive, but can't be indifferent to public sentiment.